While the eyes of the Western world were fixed upon the gray, churning waters of the English Channel and the desperate struggle for the beaches of Normandy, a catastrophe of infinitely greater magnitude was silently coalescing 1,500 kilometers to the east. On the morning of June 6, 1944, history recorded the beginning of the end for the Third Reich in France. Yet the true decisive blow, the offensive that would tear the spine out of the Wehrmacht and dictate the future of Europe, was not the one Adolf Hitler feared, but the one he arrogantly dismissed. As the Allies clawed their way inland from Omaha and Utah beaches, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov was standing in a hidden command bunker deep within the forests of Belarus, finalizing the logistical orchestration of a storm that would unleash 2.3 million men against the hollowed-out center of the German line. The catastrophic destruction of Army Group Center during the summer of 1944 was not merely a military defeat, but the inevitable, violent consequence of a specific, fatal strategic doctrine birthed in the mind of a dictator who had lost his grip on reality. To understand why 350,000 German soldiers would vanish into the swamps and killing fields of Belarus in less than 3 weeks, we must look away from the front lines and travel back to the serene, alpine isolation of the Berghof, where the seeds of this disaster were sown in an atmosphere of willful blindness and tactical rigidity. In the critical days following the Allied landings in France, Hitler's daily routine had devolved into a surreal cycle of late nights and lethargic mornings, where he would obsess over the movement of single battalions in Normandy, while entire armies in the east were being marked for annihilation. The primary cause of the looming disaster was Hitler's obsessive adherence to the Festerplatz, or Fortress City Doctrine, a strategy that demanded major logistical hubs be transformed into fortified garrisons that must hold out even when completely surrounded. In theory, these fortresses were intended to act as breakwaters, tying down Soviet forces and disrupting their supply lines. But in practice, they were death traps that scattered German combat power across isolated islands of resistance that could be easily bypassed and strangled. General Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the Army General Staff, had exhausted himself in fierce, shouting debates with the Führer, arguing that static defense against a mobile, mechanized enemy was tantamount to suicide, yet every plea for operational flexibility was met with accusations of defeatism. The psychological landscape of the German High Command had become a theater of fear and repression, where Field Marshal Ernst Busch, the commander of Army Group Center, found himself paralyzed between the undeniable intelligence reports of a massive Soviet buildup and the terrified obedience he owed to his commander-in-chief. Busch's intelligence officers had identified the ominous signs of an impending offensive, noting that Soviet reconnaissance patrols were probing the German lines with increasing aggression every single night, while partisan activity behind the front had swelled to unprecedented levels, effectively severing rail lines and blinding German logistics. On June 15, desperate to save his army from the encirclement he knew was coming, Busch flew to the Obersalzberg to beg for permission to withdraw his forward divisions to the defensible line of the Berezina River, only to be kept waiting for 2 days, like a chastised schoolboy before Hitler finally deigned to see him. When the meeting finally occurred, it lasted only 17 minutes. A brief and humiliating encounter where Hitler barely glanced at the maps showing the massive concentration of Soviet armor opposite Vitebsk and Bobruisk, waving away the evidence with the disdainful assertion that the Russians would obviously attack in the south to secure the Romanian oil fields. The Führer, eyes glossed over with the fatigue of his own nervous strain, lectured the veteran field marshal on the necessity of holding every meter of ground, insisting that retreat was not a tactical maneuver, but a symptom of moral collapse. Busch flew back to his headquarters in Minsk with empty hands and a heavy heart, carrying orders that condemned his 4 major fortress cities, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, to become tombs for the tens of thousands of men stationed within them. While Hitler moved imaginary divisions on the maps of France, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, was executing a masterclass in Maskirovka, or military deception, moving thousands of tanks and artillery pieces under the cover of darkness and imposing total radio silence to hide the sheer scale of Operation Bagration. The plan was audacious in its scope and violence, designed not just to push the Germans back, but to shatter the entire center of the Eastern Front by conducting a double envelopment that would mirror the German tactic of blitzkrieg, but on a scale the Wehrmacht could no longer match. Zhukov had amassed a staggering advantage in men and material, with 10 soldiers for every one German defender in the breakthrough sectors, and enough artillery to pulverize the German defenses into a lunar landscape before the first tank engine even roared to life. The disparity in situational awareness between the two sides was tragic and absolute. On the German side, exhausted divisions were stretched thin over hundreds of kilometers, lacking fuel, ammunition, and reserves, while on the Soviet side, a coil of immense potential energy was being wound tighter with every passing hour. The German soldiers in the trenches, veterans of 3 brutal winters, sensed the impending storm in the eerie silence of the Belarusian forests, observing the subtle changes in the enemy's behavior and the low rumble of engines drifting across the no man's land at night. Yet, bound by the rigid orders radiating from the Berghof, they were forced to remain in their exposed forward positions, digging deeper into the earth as if preparing their own graves, denied the freedom to maneuver that had once been the hallmark of the German army. The consequence of this strategic paralysis arrived with apocalyptic fury at exactly 4:05 in the morning on June 23, 1944, when the pre-dawn darkness was shattered by the simultaneous detonation of 36,000 Soviet guns along a 450-kilometer front. The opening barrage of Operation Bagration was an event of such seismic intensity that it physically altered the geography of the battlefield, collapsing deep bunkers, splintering entire forests into matchwood, and disintegrating the wire communications that were the nervous system of the German defense. For the men on the receiving end, like 22-year-old Lieutenant Heinrich Eberbach of the 31st Infantry Division near Vitebsk, the world dissolved into a chaotic singularity of noise, pressure, and dust, where the distinction between life and death became a matter of pure chance. Eberbach, sheltering in a reinforced observation bunker that was theoretically impregnable, found himself thrown against the concrete walls by the concussion of Katyusha rockets impacting mere meters away, the overpressure causing his ears to bleed and filling his lungs with the choking dust of pulverized cement. In those terrifying hours, the concept of strategy or leadership ceased to exist for the frontline soldier. There was only the primal instinct to burrow into the earth as the ground shook with the violence of a continuous earthquake. When the barrage finally lifted after 2 hours of relentless pounding, the landscape that greeted the survivors was unrecognizable. The trenches obliterated and the defensive network stripped away to reveal a gray, undulating wasteland over which thousands of Soviet infantry were already advancing in relentless waves. As the initial reports of the breakthrough began to filter up the chain of command, the disconnection between the reality on the ground and the perception at Hitler's headquarters became a widening chasm of disastrous proportions. At the Berghof, the duty officers, adhering to the terrified protocol of the court, decided not to wake the Führer with the early reports, dismissing the offensive as a local probing action rather than the strategic catastrophe it actually was. By the time Hitler awoke, bathed, and sat down for his vegetarian lunch at 1 in the afternoon, the Soviet spearheads had already penetrated deep into the German rear areas, bypassing the strong points and severing the arteries of retreat. The tragic implementation of the fortress city policy became immediately apparent at Vitebsk, where the 3rd Panzer Army found itself being rapidly enveloped by Soviet armored pincers that had no intention of assaulting the city directly. General Friedrich Gollwitzer, the commander of the Vitebsk garrison, watched in horror as his supply lines were cut one by one, realizing that his 35,000 men were being cinched into a pocket from which there would be no escape. He radioed Army Group Center for immediate permission to break out while the gap was still tenuously open, arguing that his division could still be saved to fight on the Berezina line. But the response he received was a rigid reiteration of the dogma that had doomed him. Vitebsk was a fortress, and fortresses do not move. In the cool, detached atmosphere of the Situation Room, Hitler viewed the encirclement not as a disaster, but as an opportunity, convinced that the trapped garrison would tie down vital Soviet forces and act as a breakwater against the red tide. He failed to grasp that the Soviet doctrine of deep battle had evolved, that the Red Army would simply mask the fortress with second-line troops while their tank armies drove relentlessly westward, leaving the defenders of Vitebsk to wither on the vine without food, ammunition, or hope. The orders flowing from the Wolf's Lair demanded that Gollwitzer fight to the last man, a command that transformed professional soldiers into sacrificial pawns in a game that had already been lost. Lieutenant Eberbach, having miraculously survived the initial assault by playing dead under the corpses of his own platoon, began a harrowing odyssey through the shattered rear areas, witnessing the complete disintegration of order and discipline. He crawled through drainage ditches and forests, moving only at night, and what he saw was the collapse of an army that had been stripped of its mobility and forced to fight a static battle it could not win. The roads were clogged with burning vehicles and fleeing support personnel, a chaotic stream of humanity moving west without direction or leadership, hunted by Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik attack aircraft that strafed the columns with impunity. Back at the headquarters of Army Group Center, General Bush was paralyzed by the rapidity of the collapse, his request for the release of mobile reserves denied or delayed until they were rendered meaningless by the speed of the Soviet advance. The rigid centralization of command, which required Hitler's personal approval for the movement of any division-sized unit, meant that the German reaction time was measured in days, while the Soviet advance was measured in hours. By the time permission was granted to commit the few remaining panzer divisions, they were thrown piecemeal into the meat grinder, arriving too late to seal the breaches and often finding themselves encircled before they could even deploy into combat formation. The tragedy of the Fortress City Doctrine reached its grim crescendo in Bobruisk, where 40,000 men under General Anton von Bechtolsheim were subjected to a concentric artillery bombardment that surpassed even the violence of the opening barrage. Bobruisk, unlike Vitebsk, sat on a critical road junction that the Soviets actually needed, prompting Marshal Rokossovsky to commit massive air and artillery assets to pulverize the pocket into submission. Inside the city, the scene was one of Dantean horror, with buildings collapsing into rubble and the streets choked with the wreckage of a retreating army that had nowhere left to go. Bechtolsheim, screaming over the radio for relief that would never come, was told directly by Hitler that he was the commander of a fortress and that his duty was to stand fast, a command that ignored the reality that his men were starving and out of ammunition. The cause was the delusion of a single man who believed that willpower could overcome physics. The consequence was the massacre of the Ninth Army in the swamps of the Berezina, where thousands would be slaughtered trying to cross bridges that had already been destroyed. As June turned to July, the magnitude of the disaster was absolute, yet the architect of this catastrophe remained safely ensconced in the Bavarian Alps, blaming his generals for the failure of a strategy that was doomed from its very inception. The agony of Bobruisk was not merely a military defeat. It was a humanitarian catastrophe engineered by the stubborn refusal of a distant dictator to acknowledge the laws of physics and warfare. General von Bechtolsheim, trapped within the shrinking perimeter of the city, watched as the Soviet noose tightened with a mathematical precision that mocked the frantic, delusional orders streaming in from the wolf's lair. By July 3rd, the situation had devolved into absolute bedlam, with thousands of wounded men screaming in makeshift cellars, while the Red Army's artillery hammered the city into a fine gray powder. Bechtolsheim, realizing that waiting for Hitler's permission was a death sentence for his entire command, made the fateful decision to order a breakout attempt at dawn, a desperate gamble to punch through the Soviet encirclement before the garrison was liquidated entirely. But the Soviets had anticipated this exact move, positioning their elite guards divisions along the likely escape routes and pre-registering their heavy artillery on the choke points where the German columns would inevitably bunch up. As the remnants of the Ninth Army surged forward in a disorganized mass of infantry, horse-drawn wagons, and the few remaining panzers, they ran headlong into a wall of fire that turned the roads into what survivors would later describe as rivers of blood. Soviet Il-2 Sturmoviks swarmed overhead like angry hornets, strafing the packed columns with rockets and cannon fire, transforming the breakout into a mechanized slaughter where men fought with the desperation of trapped animals, climbing over the burning wreckage of their own vehicles in a futile attempt to reach the safety of the German lines that were already retreating further west. While the Ninth Army was being butchered in the forests around Bobruisk, the Soviet armored spearheads were already racing toward Minsk, the capital of Belarus and the nerve center of Army Group Center's logistics. Minsk had been designated a Festerplatz by Hitler, a fortress that was supposed to stand as an island of resistance in the Red Sea, but the garrison commander, recognizing the futility of defending a city against a tidal wave, had already begun to withdraw his forces in direct defiance of the Führer's orders. On July 3rd, the same day Bobruisk fell, Soviet tanks from the 5th Guards Tank Army rolled into the streets of Minsk, not to face a fanatical defense, but to be greeted by cheering partisans who emerged from the cellars and sewers to reclaim their capital after 3 years of brutal occupation. The fall of Minsk was the death knell for Army Group Center, tearing a gap in the German front line that was now 400 kilometers wide, a void so massive that it could not be filled, a hole through which the Red Army could drive straight to the borders of the Reich. At the Berghof, the reaction to this catastrophic collapse was not a reevaluation of strategy, but an explosion of vindictive fury directed at the officers who had failed to execute the impossible. When Hitler learned that the commander of Minsk had withdrawn him without permission, he demanded the man be arrested and shot for cowardice, only to be informed by a pale-faced Keitel that the general had already been killed in action during the retreat. Undeterred by death, Hitler ordered that the general be court-martialed in absentia, his family arrested, and his name stricken from the rolls of honor, a macabre piece of theater designed to terrorize the living by punishing the dead. The atmosphere in the German high command had become toxic, a snake pit of suspicion where pointing out reality was tantamount to treason. General Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the general staff who had argued himself hoarse against the fortress city doctrine, finally reached his breaking point as the reports of the annihilation poured in. In a final stormy confrontation with Hitler, Zeitzler pointed to the map where 28 divisions had simply ceased to exist, telling the dictator that the war was lost unless they immediately abandoned the rigid defense and adopted a strategy of flexible maneuver. Hitler, his face a mask of contempt, stripped Zeitzler of his rank and privilege, dismissing him as a defeatist who lacked the National Socialist spirit, and replaced him with General Heinz Guderian. But even the legendary father of the Blitzkrieg could not conjure armies out of thin air. In a desperate bid to stabilize the collapsing front, Hitler finally relieved the unfortunate Field Marshal Busch, replacing him with Field Marshal Walter Model, a man known as the Führer's fireman for his uncanny ability to salvage impossible situations. Model arrived at the headquarters of Army Group Center on July 4th, expecting to take command of a fighting force, but what he found was a phantom army, a headquarters without divisions, a command structure without subordinates, and a front line that existed only on maps in Berlin. The scale of the destruction was so absolute that Model, a man of iron nerves who had survived the winter battles of Rzhev, was momentarily stunned into silence. He had been sent to put out a fire, only to find that the house had already burned to the ground. Model immediately flew back to Hitler's headquarters, demanding the authority to establish a new defensive line along the Vistula River in Poland, effectively abandoning all of Belarus and most of Lithuania in a bid to trade space for survival. Hitler, still clinging to the fantasy that the situation could be reversed by a counterattack, refused to authorize the withdrawal, promising Model that 15 fresh divisions were being transferred from other fronts to retake Minsk. Model, staring into the eyes of a man who had lost all connection with the battlefield, returned to the front knowing the reinforcements were a lie, and began to organize a fighting retreat based on his own authority, ignoring orders from Berlin whenever they conflicted with the survival of his remaining troops. For the common soldier on the ground, the grand strategic arguments of field marshals were irrelevant. Their reality had narrowed to the singular, consuming need to survive the next hour. Lieutenant Eberbach, still moving west with his 2 surviving companions, had become part of a vast, pathetic migration of humanity that clogged the roads leading to Poland. He saw sights that shattered the myth of the Aryan Superman forever. Colonels weeping by the roadside, soldiers throwing away their rifles to walk faster, and the grisly tableau of officers who had chosen a bullet in the brain rather than face the shame of captivity or the terror of a Soviet gulag. The discipline that had once been the iron backbone of the Wehrmacht had fractured, replaced by a primal, terrifying anarchy where the only law was movement. West, always west, away from the rumble of the Soviet artillery. By mid-July, the Soviet advance had achieved a momentum that seemed unstoppable, tearing through the German rear areas with a speed that made the Blitzkrieg of 1941 look sluggish by comparison. The Red Army had liberated Belarus in weeks, an operation that German planners had estimated would take months, proving that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The strategic consequence of Hitler's refusal to retreat was that the Red Army now stood on the banks of the Vistula, gazing across the river at the spires of Warsaw, poised to strike into the very heart of the Third Reich. Operation Bagration had not just defeated an army group, it had destroyed the strategic integrity of the entire Eastern Front, creating a domino effect that would eventually lead to the fall of Berlin. The shockwaves of the disaster reverberated all the way back to the paranoid inner circles of the Nazi regime, fueling the desperation of the military resistance that would culminate in the July 20th plot. For Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators, the destruction of Army Group Center was the final, undeniable proof that Hitler was leading Germany into the abyss, and that only his removal could save the nation from total annihilation. When the bomb exploded in the Wolf's Lair, failing to kill the dictator but shattering his eardrums and his remaining trust in the army, Hitler drew the exact wrong conclusion from the events of the summer. He became convinced that the catastrophe in the East was not a result of his poor leadership or the enemy's strength, but of a vast, sprawling betrayal by the officer corps, a stab in the back that excused his own strategic incompetence. This paranoia led to a purge of the military leadership that decapitated the Wehrmacht at the precise moment it needed experienced commanders the most. Thousands of officers were arrested, tortured, and executed in the wake of the assassination attempt, while the front continued to crumble. The fortress city policy, despite its catastrophic failure in Belarus, was not abandoned but doubled down upon, with Hitler designating new cities like Vilna and Breslau as fortresses that must hold to the last man. The tragedy repeated itself in a grim cycle. A city would be surrounded, the garrison would request a breakout, the request would be denied, and the garrison would be destroyed, feeding the insatiable hunger of a war machine that had long since escaped human control. Lieutenant Eberbach's war ended not in glory, but in a muddy trench near Grodno, where he was placed in command of a Kampfgruppe, cobbled together from cooks, clerks, and stragglers, 63 men with rifles, and a few Panzerfaust tasked with stopping a Soviet tank brigade. The absurdity of the order was palpable, yet they dug in, driven by fear of the enemy in front and the flying court-martials behind them. When the Soviet tanks appeared, rolling over the horizon like unstoppable steel beasts, the battle lasted less than an hour. Eberbach was wounded again, shrapnel tearing into his leg, and he was dragged to the rear by his men, leaving the village burning behind them as yet another imperative defensive position fell to the sheer weight of Soviet metal. Back in the map room of the Wolf's Lair, Hitler continued to move flags representing divisions that had been reduced to company strength, lecturing his surviving generals on the importance of fanaticism. He spoke of Frederick the Great, of the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, convinced that if he simply held on long enough, the unnatural alliance between the capitalist West and the communist East would fracture. He did not see the mud, the blood, or the piles of corpses. He saw only the abstract purity of the map, where a line drawn in grease pencil was a reality that could be enforced by will alone. This cognitive dissonance was the true weapon that destroyed the Wehrmacht, a self-inflicted wound that bled the German army white, while its supreme commander obsessively micromanaged the placement of machine gun nests from a bunker 1,000 kilometers away. The ultimate humiliation and the undeniable proof of the disaster came on July 17, 1944, not on the battlefield, but on the streets of Moscow. In a spectacle designed to show the world the scale of the German defeat, the Soviets marched 57,000 German prisoners through the capital, a sea of gray uniforms stretching for miles. The men haggard, unshaven, and defeated. They were led by 19 captured German generals, men like Gollwitzer, who had followed orders to the letter, their iron crosses hanging heavily on their necks as they were paraded past the silent, staring crowds of Russian civilians. Following the column, massive street sweeper trucks washed the pavement with water, a symbolic gesture to cleanse the soil of the motherland from the fascist filth, a propaganda coup that shattered any remaining German claims of a strategic withdrawal. The destruction of Army Group Center was the single greatest military defeat in German history, eclipsing Stalingrad in both scale and consequence. It cost the Wehrmacht over 400,000 casualties and completely shattered the myth of German operational superiority. But the true tragedy lay in the fact that it was preventable. The intelligence had been there, the request for withdrawal had been timely, and the mobile reserves had been available. The army died not because it was outfought, though the Soviet performance was brilliant, but because it was shackled to a doctrine of static defense that was obsolete in the face of modern mechanized warfare. As the summer of 1944 faded into autumn, The borders of the Reich were breached, and the war came home to Germany. The legacy of Operation Bagration was written in the ruins of the fortress cities and the unmarked graves of hundreds of thousands of men who were sacrificed on the altar of one man's ego. In the end, the order to hold at all costs cost everything. The shield was broken, the sword was shattered, and the road to Berlin lay open, paved with the consequences of a delusion that refused to bend to reality until the very moment the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. If Hitler had allowed Army Group Center to retreat to the Vistula River before the attack, do you think the Wehrmacht could have held the line? Or was the Soviet military machine simply too powerful by 1944? Let us know your analysis in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.